Daniel Carter walked through the thick forest with his dog Ranger by his side. The evening air was cool and the sun was setting behind the mountains. Daniel had been living in this cabin for 3 years now, far away from everyone and everything. He liked it that way. After what happened in the war, he needed the quiet. Ranger was a German shepherd who had served with him in the Marines. They had both been through hell together, and now they were both trying to find peace in these mountains. Daniel stopped to catch his breath near a large pine tree. His legs still hurt sometimes from the injury that ended his career. Ranger sat down next to him and looked up at the darkening sky. The dog's ears suddenly perked up and he stood at attention. Daniel noticed the change in his partner's behavior immediately. Something was wrong. Ranger never acted this way unless there was danger. Then Daniel saw it too. A bright streak of light tore across the sky like a burning arrow. It was moving fast and leaving a trail of fire behind it. The light got brighter and brighter as it came closer to the ground. Daniel felt the earth shake under his feet when the object hit somewhere in the valley below. The sound was deafening and echoed through the mountains like thunder. Birds flew out of the trees in panic and the forest went silent after the crash. Daniel's first thought was to go back to the cabin and call someone. But Ranger was already moving toward the crash site. The dog looked back at Daniel as if asking him to follow. Daniel hesitated for a moment. He knew he should stay away from whatever just fell from the sky. It could be dangerous. It could be a satellite or a military aircraft. But something inside him, the part that made him a Marine, told him that someone might need help. He followed Ranger down the rocky slope toward the valley. The trees were thick and the ground was covered with fallen leaves that made it hard to walk quietly. As they got closer, Daniel could smell smoke and burning metal. The air tasted strange, almost electric. Ranger moved carefully now, his training kicking in as he scouted ahead and came back to Daniel every few minutes. After 20 minutes of hiking through the difficult terrain, Daniel saw the crash site. What he found made him stop in his tracks and question everything he thought he knew about the world. This was not a satellite or an aircraft. The object was sleek and made of a dark metal that seemed to absorb light. It was about the size of a small car but shaped like nothing Daniel had ever seen. The craft was embedded in the side of the mountain, and smoke was rising from several cracks in its hull. Daniel approached slowly with his hand on the knife he always carried. Ranger growled low in his throat but stayed close to Daniel's leg. The craft had strange symbols on its side that glowed faintly in the darkness. There was a panel that looked like it might be a door, but Daniel had no idea how to open it. He walked around the craft looking for any sign of life inside. Then he heard it. A weak groan came from inside the craft. Someone was alive in there. Daniel's training took over and he stopped thinking about how strange this all was. Someone needed help and that was all that mattered. He found a gap in the hull where the metal had torn during the crash. Using his knife and a piece of broken tree branch, he managed to pry the opening wider. Inside the craft, Daniel could barely see anything. He pulled out his flashlight and shined it into the dark interior. The inside was filled with equipment and screens that were either broken or flickering. And there in the pilot's seat was a person. She was wearing some kind of uniform that Daniel had never seen before. The woman was unconscious and bleeding from a wound on her head. Her breathing was shallow and her skin was pale. Daniel climbed into the craft carefully and checked her pulse. It was weak but steady. He looked at her uniform more closely and saw patches and insignia that made no sense. The symbols were nothing like any military he knew. But right now that didn't matter. This woman was dying and he had the skills to help her. He carefully unfastened her harness and checked for other injuries. She had a broken arm and probably some broken ribs. There was a lot of blood coming from the head wound, but it didn't look as bad as it could have been. Daniel took off his jacket and used his shirt to apply pressure to the wound. Ranger barked from outside the craft as if urging Daniel to hurry. Daniel knew he had to get this woman back to his cabin. She needed shelter and medical attention. He had supplies at home from his time as a combat medic. It wasn't a hospital, but it was better than leaving her here in this smoking wreck. He managed to lift the woman carefully and carry her out of the craft. She was light, but moving through the forest with an injured person was never easy. Ranger led the way back to the cabin, taking a different path that was easier to navigate. The dog seemed to understand the urgency of the situation. Daniel's arms burned from carrying the woman, but he didn't stop. Every few minutes he checked to make sure she was still breathing. The walk back took almost an hour, and by the time he reached his cabin, Daniel was exhausted. He laid the woman on his bed and immediately got to work. He cleaned the head wound and stitched it closed. He set her broken arm and wrapped her ribs. All the while, the woman remained unconscious. Daniel set up an IV drip to keep her hydrated and gave her antibiotics to prevent infection. Ranger lay down next to the bed and watched over the stranger as if she was part of their pack now. As Daniel sat back and looked at the woman, he realized his quiet life was over. This person was wearing a uniform from no country he recognized. She had been flying in a craft that couldn't possibly exist with current technology, and she had fallen from the sky like a meteor. Daniel had no idea who she was or where she came from, but he knew one thing for certain. His life had just become very complicated and nothing would ever be the same again. 2 days passed before the woman opened her eyes. Daniel had been checking on her every few hours, making sure she was stable. Ranger never left the bedside except to eat or go outside. The dog had formed some kind of bond with the stranger that Daniel couldn't quite explain. On the morning of the 3rd day, Daniel was cleaning the woman's wounds when her eyes suddenly opened. She looked around the cabin in confusion and panic. She tried to sit up quickly, but Daniel gently pushed her back down. She was speaking in English, but some of the words she used made no sense. She kept asking about something called a temporal displacement and whether the Krell had followed her. Daniel tried to calm her down and told her she was safe. She looked at him with sharp green eyes and seemed to be analyzing everything about him. After a moment, she relaxed slightly and lay back on the pillow. The woman introduced herself as Commander Lyra Quinn. She asked Daniel what year it was, and when he told her it was 2024, her face went pale. She closed her eyes and whispered something under her breath that sounded like a curse. Daniel asked her if she was from some kind of secret military program. Lyra laughed, but there was no humor in it. She said the truth was much stranger than that and asked if Daniel was ready to hear something impossible. Daniel sat down in the chair next to the bed and told her to go ahead. He had seen a lot of impossible things in his life, and one more wouldn't break him. Lyra took a deep breath and told him she was from the year 2247. She was a fighter pilot in the United Earth Space Navy. Humanity had joined something called the Galactic Confederation and was fighting a war against an alien species called the Krell. Daniel listened without interrupting, even though every word sounded like pure insanity. Lyra explained that she had been on a reconnaissance mission deep in enemy territory. Her squadron was tracking a Krell fleet when they encountered an experimental weapon. The weapon created some kind of tear in space and time. Her fighter got caught in the blast and she was thrown backward through time. She had no idea if any of her squadron survived or if they even knew where she went. All she knew was that she was now over 200 years in the past with no way to get home. Daniel didn't know what to believe. The logical part of his brain told him this was impossible. Time travel didn't exist. Aliens didn't exist. But he had seen her craft with his own eyes. He had seen technology that was far beyond anything the military had today. And there was something about the way Lyra spoke that made him think she was telling the truth. She wasn't trying to convince him or prove anything. She was just stating facts as she knew them. Lyra asked if Daniel had found anything else at the crash site. He told her he had been too focused on getting her to safety to look around. She tried to get out of bed, but Daniel stopped her. She was in no condition to walk anywhere. Lyra insisted that they needed to go back to the crash site. There were things in her fighter that couldn't fall into the wrong hands. Technology from the future could change history in terrible ways if someone found it and figured out how to use it. Daniel agreed to go back to the crash site, but only if Lyra stayed in bed and rested. She reluctantly agreed, but made him promise to bring back specific items. She described a small black box that contained her mission data and a device that looked like a metal cylinder. Daniel wrote down her descriptions and prepared to head out. Ranger stood up as if ready to go with him, but Daniel told the dog to stay and watch over Lyra. The dog seemed to understand and lay back down next to the bed. The hike back to the crash site took less time now that Daniel knew the way. When he arrived, he saw that the craft had stopped smoking, but the metal still looked hot. He carefully climbed inside and searched for the items Lyra had described. He found the black box easily. It was attached to some kind of panel near the pilot's seat. The cylinder was harder to find, but eventually, he located it in a storage compartment under the main controls. While he was searching, Daniel noticed other things in the craft. There were weapons that looked nothing like any gun he had ever seen. There were devices with screens that still flickered with strange symbols, and there were photos attached to the wall near the pilot's seat. The photos showed Lyra with other people in uniform. They were smiling and looked happy. Daniel realized that Lyra had left behind a whole life when she got thrown back in time. She had friends and maybe family who thought she was dead. Daniel gathered everything he could carry and made his way back to the cabin. When he arrived, he found Lyra sitting up in bed with Ranger's head on her lap. She was petting the dog gently and talking to him in a soft voice. She looked up when Daniel entered, and her eyes lit up when she saw the items he was carrying. Daniel handed her the black box and the cylinder. Lyra held them like they were the most precious things in the world. She explained that the black box contained critical intelligence about the Krell invasion routes. Her mission had been to gather information about where the Krell were planning to attack next. If this information didn't reach her commanders in the future, billions of people would die. The Krell were a hive mind species that consumed everything in their path. They turned planets into dead rocks and enslaved any species they didn't kill. Humanity had been fighting them for 30 years, and the war was not going well. Daniel asked why humans were even fighting aliens. Lyra smiled sadly and said it was because humans were good at fighting. When Earth joined the Galactic Confederation, other species quickly realized that humans had a talent for warfare. Humans thought differently than most other species. They were unpredictable and creative and stubborn. They never gave up even when the odds were impossible. The Confederation had been losing the war against the Krell until humans joined the fight. Now the war was a stalemate, but it could go either way. Daniel felt strange hearing about humanity's future. On one hand, it was exciting to know that humans would reach the stars and join alien civilizations. On the other hand, it was depressing to know that even in the future, humanity was still fighting wars. Lyra seemed to read his thoughts and told him that some things never change. War was part of life, whether you were on Earth or in space. The only difference was the scale and the stakes. Lyra then explained what the cylinder was. It was a quantum beacon. If activated at the right place and time, it could send a signal forward to her era. The signal would carry the mission data and let her commanders know what happened to her. The problem was that the beacon needed very specific conditions to work. It needed a temporal weak point in Earth's magnetic field, and those only appeared in certain locations at certain times. Lyra had calculations in her flight computer that would tell her where and when the next weak point would appear. Daniel asked if the beacon could bring her home. Lyra shook her head and said it was only a one-way signal. Once she sent the data forward, she would still be stuck in the past. There was no way to reverse the temporal displacement that brought her here. She would have to live out the rest of her life in this time period. Daniel could see the pain in her eyes as she said this. She was accepting that she would never see her home or her friends again. She would never know if humanity won the war, or if the Krell consumed everything she loved. 3 days after Lyra woke up, things started to go wrong. Daniel noticed that Ranger was acting strange. The dog would stand at the window and growl at something in the forest that Daniel couldn't see. At night, Ranger refused to sleep and kept pacing around the cabin. Daniel trusted his dog's instincts more than anything else in the world. If Ranger sensed danger, then danger was coming. Lyra had been recovering well and could now walk around the cabin with minimal pain. She was working on a device she had built from parts of her flight computer. She called it a scanner and said it could detect energy signatures that normal human technology couldn't pick up. Daniel watched as she powered up the device and pointed it toward the forest. The screen showed several red dots moving between the trees. Lyra's face went white and she dropped the scanner. She told Daniel they had to leave immediately. The Krell had found her. Daniel asked how that was possible. Lyra explained that the Krell had basic time-tracking technology. They couldn't travel through time themselves, but they could detect temporal anomalies. When she got thrown back in time, it created a ripple that the Krell could follow. They must have sent scouts through the same temporal tear to eliminate any witnesses and recover her mission data. Daniel looked out the window and tried to see what Ranger was sensing. The forest looked normal, but he knew better than to trust appearances. He asked Lyra how dangerous these scouts were. She told him that a single Krell scout could kill 12 armed soldiers. They were fast, strong, and had natural armor that could stop most bullets. Krell scouts also had weapons that fired plasma bolts hot enough to melt steel. Daniel realized they were in serious trouble. He immediately started preparing the cabin's defenses. Daniel had always been paranoid about security, so he had supplies that most people wouldn't keep in their home. He had explosives left over from his military days. He had tripwires and motion sensors hidden around the property. He had weapons and ammunition stored in waterproof cases. Lyra was impressed by his preparations and said it reminded her of the stories about early human soldiers. Humans in her time were known for being paranoid and overprepared, which was exactly why they survived so many battles. As night fell, Daniel set up his defenses around the cabin. He placed explosives at key points along the trails leading to his property. He set up tripwires connected to flares that would give them warning if something approached. He checked his weapons and made sure every gun was loaded and ready. Lyra watched him work and offered advice about Krell tactics. She told him that Krell scouts hunted in groups of 3, and they preferred to attack from multiple directions at once. Around midnight, Ranger started barking. The motion sensors around the property lit up one by one. Something was moving through the forest and it was coming fast. Daniel told Lyra to stay inside while he went out to face whatever was coming. She refused and grabbed one of the strange weapons from her crash site. The weapon looked like a rifle, but it had no visible barrel. Lyra checked the charge and said it was ready to fire. The first Krell scout came from the east side of the property. Daniel saw it through his night vision scope and his blood ran cold. The creature was about 7 feet tall and walked on 4 legs like an insect. Its body was covered in black armor that looked like it was part of its skin. It had multiple eyes that glowed red in the darkness and mandibles that clicked together as it moved. The scout was carrying some kind of weapon attached to one of its arms. Daniel fired first and hit the scout in what he hoped was its head. The bullet bounced off the armor without leaving a mark. The scout turned toward him and raised its weapon. Daniel dove behind a tree just as a bolt of plasma hit where he had been standing. The tree exploded into flames and the heat was intense even from several feet away. Daniel realized his normal weapons were almost useless against these things. Ranger came running from the cabin and attacked the scout from behind. The dog bit into one of the scout's legs and held on despite the creature's attempts to shake him off. The scout let out a sound that was like a scream mixed with static. It tried to aim its weapon at Ranger, but the dog was too fast and too close. Daniel used the distraction to run closer and throw one of his homemade explosives at the scout's feet. The explosion knocked the scout off balance and damaged its armor. Daniel could see cracks where the hardened plates had broken. He fired again, and this time the bullet penetrated the crack and hit something vital. The scout collapsed and stopped moving. Green liquid oozed from the wound and burned the ground where it fell. Daniel called Ranger back and checked the dog for injuries. Ranger was fine, but Daniel could tell the dog was shaken by the encounter. Before Daniel could catch his breath, 2 more scouts appeared. One came from the west and another from the north, just like Lyra had predicted. Daniel realized they were being surrounded and coordinated. He ran back toward the cabin while firing at both scouts to keep them at a distance. The scouts returned fire and plasma bolts lit up the night sky. One bolt hit the cabin's roof and started a fire. Lyra came out of the cabin firing her weapon. The beam from her rifle was bright blue, and when it hit the western scout, the creature's armor melted like wax. The scout fell and didn't get back up. Daniel was amazed by the power of future weapons. He wished he had more of them. The northern scout seemed to realize it was outmatched and started to retreat into the forest. Daniel triggered one of his tripwires and the explosive detonated right under the scout. The blast threw the creature into a tree where it lay broken and unmoving. Daniel and Lyra stood in the smoking ruins of the cabin's front yard. Ranger was panting heavily, and Daniel could see scratches on the dog's fur where the Krell had tried to hit him. The cabin was on fire and everything Daniel owned was inside. Lyra put her hand on his shoulder and told him they couldn't stay here. More Krell would come, and next time there might be more than 3. They had to move, and they had to do it now. Daniel quickly gathered what supplies he could from the cabin before the fire spread. He grabbed his medical kit, his weapons, food, water, and warm clothes. Lyra took her devices and the quantum beacon. Daniel made a pack for Ranger with supplies the dog could carry. As they left the burning cabin behind, Daniel looked back one last time. This had been his home for 3 years. It was where he had tried to find peace after the war. Now it was gone. They walked into the forest heading north. Lyra said the nearest temporal weak point was about 300 miles away at an old military facility. They had 5 days to reach it before the window closed. Daniel asked what would happen if they didn't make it in time. Lyra said the mission data would be lost forever, and the Krell would win the war in her time. Billions of people would die and humanity would be wiped out. The stakes couldn't be higher. As they traveled through the dark forest, Daniel realized his life had completely changed. 3 days ago, he was a lonely veteran trying to forget his past. Now he was traveling with a soldier from the future, being hunted by alien creatures and carrying information that could save humanity. He looked at Ranger walking beside him and then at Lyra leading the way. Daniel had spent 3 years wondering what his purpose was after the war. Maybe this was it. Maybe he was meant to be here at this exact moment to help save the future. It sounded crazy, but after everything he had seen, crazy was starting to feel normal. Daniel had never expected to be back on a mission again. He thought his military days were over when he left the service 3 years ago. But here he was, hiking through the wilderness with a soldier from the future and a dog who had saved his life more times than he could count. The journey north was difficult. They had to avoid roads and towns because they couldn't risk anyone seeing them. Lyra's uniform and equipment would raise too many questions, and the Krell scouts might still be tracking them. They traveled mostly at night and rested during the day. Ranger scouted ahead and warned them of any dangers. Daniel was impressed by how well Lyra moved through the terrain despite her recent injuries. She was clearly well-trained and experienced. During one of their rest stops, Daniel asked her about her life in the future. Lyra smiled and told him about the Earth she came from. Cities that reached into the clouds, ships that could travel between stars in weeks instead of years, medical technology that could cure almost any disease. But Daniel noticed that when Lyra talked about the future, there was always a shadow in her eyes. He asked her what was wrong, and she was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she told him about the colony where she grew up. It was called New Terra, and it orbited a star 30 light-years from Earth. The colony had 2 million people and was one of humanity's most successful settlements. 5 years ago, the Krell attacked without warning. By the time the military arrived, the colony was gone. Every person was dead or taken. Lyra had been away at the academy when it happened. Her parents, her younger brother, and all her friends were killed in a single day. Daniel understood that kind of pain. He told Lyra about his unit and what happened in the desert. They had been on a routine patrol when the IED went off. Daniel was thrown clear, but 12 of his friends died in the explosion. He spent months in the hospital recovering from his injuries. The physical wounds healed, but the mental ones never did. He couldn't understand why he survived when so many others didn't. The guilt ate him every single day until he finally left the service and tried to disappear. Into the mountains, Lyra looked at Daniel with understanding in her eyes. She said that every soldier carried that same guilt. It didn't matter if you were fighting in a desert on Earth or in space against aliens. The feeling was always the same. You survived and others didn't, and nothing could make that fair. But she had learned something over the years. The best way to honor the dead was to keep fighting, to make sure their sacrifice meant something. That was why she volunteered for the dangerous recon mission. She wanted to hurt the Krell as much as they had hurt her. Daniel realized that he and Lyra were more alike than he had thought. They were both soldiers who had lost everything. They both carried guilt that would never go away. And they were both still fighting even when it seemed hopeless. Daniel felt something shift inside him. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he had a purpose again. He was going to help Lyra complete her mission. He was going to make sure that the information she carried reached the future. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally forgive himself for surviving. On the 3rd day of their journey, they had to pass through a small town. There was no way around it, and they were running low on supplies. Daniel went in alone while Lyra and Ranger waited in the forest. He bought food, water, batteries, and medical supplies. While he was in the store, he saw a news report on television. The report was about strange lights in the sky and several people who had gone missing in the mountains. The government was saying it was nothing to worry about, but Daniel could read between the lines. They knew something strange was happening, and they were trying to keep it quiet. Daniel left the town as quickly as possible and returned to Lyra. He told her about the news report, and she looked worried. She said the Krell were being sloppy. They were supposed to be covert, but they were leaving evidence everywhere. That meant either they didn't care about being discovered or they were desperate to find her. Neither option was good. Daniel asked if the government might be able to help them. Lyra shook her head and said that would only make things worse. If the military got involved, they would take the mission data and probably lock her up for study. The beacon wouldn't get activated and the future would be lost. They continued north and the terrain got more difficult. They were moving into mountainous country where the weather was colder, and the trails were dangerous. Ranger was struggling to keep up with the weight of his pack. Daniel took some of the dog's load and carried it himself. Lyra offered to help, but Daniel could see she was still in pain from her injuries. He told her to save her strength for when they really needed it. During a rest stop on the 4th day, Lyra started teaching Daniel about the Krell. She wanted him to understand what they were really up against. The Krell were not like humans or any other species in the Confederation. They were a hive mind controlled by queens who directed billions of workers and warriors. Individual Krell had no personality or free will. They existed only to serve the hive. The Krell consumed planets by stripping them of all resources and moving on to the next target. They had been doing this for thousands of years and had destroyed countless civilizations. Daniel asked why the Confederation didn't just wipe out the Krell homeworld. Lyra laughed bitterly and said they had tried. The problem was that no one knew where the Krell came from. They had no homeworld that anyone could find. The Krell traveled in massive hive ships that were each the size of a moon. They bred on these ships and never stayed in one place for long. The only way to fight them was to destroy their ships one at a time, but they had hundreds of ships and the Confederation was running out of resources. That was why Lyra's mission was so important. She had discovered a pattern in the Krell attacks. They were building up forces for a major assault on Earth itself. If her intelligence reached the future, the military could prepare defenses and maybe stop the attack before it happened. But if the information was lost, Earth would be caught off guard and billions would die. The fate of humanity literally rested in the small black box that Lyra carried. Daniel felt the weight of that responsibility. He had carried important things in the war before. He had delivered messages and transported wounded soldiers, but this was different. This wasn't just about one battle or one war. This was about the survival of the entire human race across all of time. If he failed, everything he knew and everyone he loved would eventually be destroyed. The pressure was intense, but Daniel pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to think about the big picture. He just had to focus on the next step, the next mile, the next day. On the 5th day, they finally saw their destination in the distance. The old military facility sat on top of a mountain surrounded by fences and warning signs. It had been abandoned years ago, but Lyra's scanner showed it was not as empty as it appeared. There were energy readings coming from inside the facility. Daniel used his binoculars to get a better look, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There were vehicles parked outside the facility that definitely didn't belong to the government. And there were figures moving around that were too large and oddly shaped to be human. Lyra looked through her scanner and confirmed his fears. The Krell had beaten them to the facility. They were already there and they were doing something with the temporal weak point. Lyra said they must be trying to open a bigger rift to bring more Krell through time. If that happened, the Krell could invade the past and change history itself. They would consume Earth before humanity ever developed space travel. Everything that Lyra's future would be erased. Daniel realized they had a new problem. They not only had to activate the beacon, but they also had to stop whatever the Krell were doing. He looked at Lyra and asked if she was ready for this. She checked her weapon and nodded. Daniel looked down at Ranger and the dog looked back with complete trust in his eyes. The three of them had been through hell together over the past week. They had fought aliens, survived attacks, and traveled across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Now they faced the final battle. Daniel took a deep breath and started making a plan. This was what he had been trained for. This was what he was meant to do. Daniel spent hours watching the facility through his binoculars. He counted at least 6 Krell moving around the perimeter, and there were probably more inside. The creatures were setting up some kind of equipment near the main building. Lyra watched through her scanner and explained that the Krell were building a temporal amplifier. If they finished it, the small rift that brought Lyra here would become large enough to bring through an entire invasion force. They needed a new plan. Daniel suggested they wait until dark and try to sneak past the Krell to reach the beacon activation point. Lyra shook her head and said the Krell could see in multiple spectrums of light. Darkness wouldn't hide them. Daniel thought for a moment and then had another idea. They needed a distraction, something big enough to draw the Krell away from the main building while they snuck in the back way. Before they could finalize any plans, they heard movement in the forest behind them. Daniel and Lyra spun around with weapons ready. 3 men in tactical gear emerged from the trees with their guns pointed at them. Daniel recognized the lead man immediately. It was his former squad mate, Kyle Henderson. Kyle stared at Daniel in shock and slowly lowered his weapon. He asked what Daniel was doing here and who the woman with the strange equipment was. Daniel quickly made up a story about stumbling onto some kind of terrorist cell that had taken over the facility. He said they had advanced weapons and were planning something big. Kyle looked skeptical, but Daniel could see he wanted to believe his old friend. Kyle explained that the military had sent his team to investigate the strange reports coming from this area. They had tracked energy signatures to this location and were about to assault the facility when they spotted Daniel. Lyra pulled Daniel aside and whispered that they couldn't involve regular soldiers in this fight. The Krell would kill them all and the temporal situation was too complex to explain. Daniel understood, but he also knew they needed help. 6 Krell were too many for just the 2 of them to handle. He told Lyra to trust him and turned back to Kyle. He said they needed to work together to stop whatever was happening in that facility. Kyle agreed, but said they were doing this by the book. His team would lead the assault and Daniel would stay back with Lyra. Daniel knew that wouldn't work, but he didn't argue. They moved closer to the facility with Kyle's team. The team consisted of 4 men, including Kyle. They were well trained, but Daniel knew they had no idea what they were about to face. As they got into position, Daniel pulled Kyle aside one more time. He told his old friend that the enemy in that facility was not human. He said they were dangerous beyond anything Kyle had seen before. Kyle looked at Daniel like he was crazy, but there was something in Daniel's eyes that made him pause. The assault began at sunset. Kyle's team moved in from the south while Daniel, Lyra, and Ranger circled around to the north. The plan was for Kyle to create a distraction, while Daniel and Lyra reached the beacon activation point. Everything went wrong almost immediately. As soon as Kyle's team opened fire, the Krell responded with overwhelming force. The plasma weapons lit up the evening sky and Daniel heard screams over the radio. Daniel wanted to help, but Lyra grabbed his arm and told him they had to complete the mission. If they didn't activate the beacon, Kyle and his team would die for nothing. Daniel hated it, but he knew she was right. They ran toward the north entrance while explosions and gunfire echoed behind them. Ranger led the way and alerted them to 2 Krell guards at the door. Daniel and Lyra took them down quickly and entered the facility. Inside, the building was a maze of corridors and rooms. Lyra followed her scanner toward the temporal weak point. They moved quickly but carefully. They could hear more Krell in the building responding to the attack outside. Daniel knew Kyle's team couldn't hold out much longer. They reached a large central room and found what they were looking for. The temporal weak point looked like a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Lyra immediately started setting up the quantum beacon. While Lyra worked, Daniel guarded the door. He could hear Krell moving through the corridors, getting closer. Ranger stood next to him with his teeth bared. Daniel checked his ammunition and realized he was running low. He looked back at Lyra and asked how much time she needed. She said at least 5 minutes to calibrate the beacon properly. Daniel knew they didn't have 5 minutes, but he told her to work as fast as she could. The first Krell found them before Lyra was ready. Daniel fired and managed to hit it in a weak point near its neck. The creature went down, but 3 more appeared behind it. Daniel threw his last grenade and the explosion bought them a few seconds. He reloaded while Ranger attacked one of the Krell. The dog was incredibly brave, but Daniel knew Ranger couldn't fight these things alone. Lyra shouted that she was almost done, but she needed just 2 more minutes. A Krell warrior burst through the door and knocked Daniel to the ground. The creature raised its weapon to kill him, but Ranger jumped onto its back and bit into the joint where its head met its body. The Krell thrashed around trying to shake the dog off. Daniel grabbed his knife and drove it into the creature's eye. The Krell finally fell and Daniel scrambled to his feet. He looked around for Ranger and saw that the dog was hurt. One of the Krell's strikes had caught Ranger in the side and there was blood on the floor. Daniel ran to his partner, but Ranger was still standing. The dog looked at Daniel with those loyal eyes, and Daniel knew his friend would fight until there was nothing left. Daniel felt tears in his eyes, but he pushed them back. They weren't done yet. More Krell were coming. Daniel could hear them in the hallway. He took position at the door with the last of his ammunition. Lyra was working frantically on the beacon and sweat was running down her face. Daniel asked how much longer and she said 30 seconds. Daniel nodded and prepared for what might be his last stand. He thought about his unit and everyone he had lost. He thought about how he had survived when they didn't. Maybe this was why. Maybe he was meant to be here at this exact moment to give Lyra the time she needed. The Krell came at him in a wave. Daniel fired until his gun clicked empty. He drew his knife and prepared to fight hand to hand. But before the Krell could reach him, gunfire erupted from behind the creatures. Kyle and one other member of his team appeared in the hallway. They were both wounded but still fighting. Kyle's eyes were wide with fear and disbelief. He had finally seen what the Krell really were, and it had shaken him to his core. Kyle and his teammate held the hallway while Daniel turned back to Lyra. She shouted that the beacon was ready. Daniel looked at the shimmering temporal weak point, and then at Ranger, who was lying on the floor bleeding. He looked at Lyra and saw that she understood what he was thinking. In that moment, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. He told Lyra that she had to take Ranger with her when she activated the beacon. Lyra said that was impossible. The temporal displacement could kill them both. Daniel didn't care. He wasn't going to let Ranger die here when there was a future with medical technology that could save him. Lyra tried to argue, but Daniel was firm. He had already made up his mind. Ranger had saved his life more times than he could count. Now it was his turn to save Ranger. The Krell were pushing through despite Kyle's resistance. Daniel picked up Ranger gently and carried him to where Lyra stood with the beacon. The dog whined softly but didn't resist. Daniel looked into Ranger's eyes and told his best friend that everything would be okay. He told the dog to take care of Lyra and to be good. Ranger licked Daniel's hand one last time, and then Daniel handed him to Lyra. Lyra held Ranger in her arms and looked at Daniel with tears in her eyes. She understood what he was sacrificing. Daniel was giving up the one thing in the world that mattered to him so that his partner could live. She wanted to tell him there had to be another way, but the sounds of fighting in the hallway told her there was no time. The Krell were breaking through and Kyle's team couldn't hold them much longer. Daniel stepped back and told Lyra to activate the beacon now. Lyra placed her hand on the quantum beacon and it began to glow with an intense blue light. The temporal weak point in the air started to expand and pull at everything around it. Daniel felt the pull, but he stood firm. He watched as Lyra and Ranger began to fade like they were made of smoke. The last thing he saw was Ranger's eyes looking at him with trust and love. Then they were gone and the beacon exploded in a flash of light that knocked everyone in the facility off their feet. Daniel woke up a few seconds later to find the room in chaos. The temporal weak point was gone, and so was all of the Krell's equipment. The explosion had destroyed everything. The Krell in the hallway were disoriented and confused. Kyle was pulling Daniel to his feet and shouting at him to move. They ran through the corridors with the surviving member of Kyle's team. Behind them, they could hear the Krell recovering and starting to pursue. They burst out of the facility into the night air. Kyle's team had vehicles waiting, and they jumped in. As they drove away, Daniel looked back at the facility and saw it explode. The Krell must have rigged it to self-destruct when they realized their mission had failed. The explosion lit up the night sky like a second sun. Daniel felt empty inside. Ranger was gone. Lyra was gone. The mission was over, and he had no idea if they had succeeded or not. The next few hours were a blur. Kyle's team took Daniel to a secure military location, where he was questioned by officers who didn't understand what had happened. Daniel stuck to his cover story about terrorists with advanced weapons. He didn't mention time travel or aliens or anything that would get him locked up in a psychiatric ward. The officers were skeptical, but they had no better explanation for what their teams had encountered. The bodies of the Krell had dissolved into nothing after they died, leaving no evidence. Kyle pulled Daniel aside during a break in the questioning. He asked what really happened back there. Daniel looked at his old friend and wondered how much he could say. Kyle had seen the Krell with his own eyes. He knew they weren't human. Daniel finally told him that some things were better left unknown. Kyle looked frustrated, but he nodded. He said he trusted Daniel, and if Daniel said they did the right thing, then that was good enough for him. After 2 days of questioning, the military finally let Daniel go. They couldn't hold him because he hadn't technically broken any laws. They made him sign documents promising never to speak about what happened and threatened him with treason if he did. Daniel signed everything they put in front of him. He just wanted to go home, except he didn't have a home anymore. His cabin had burned down and everything he owned was gone. Daniel spent the next few months drifting. The military gave him some money as compensation for his help in stopping the terrorist threat. He used it to rent a small apartment in a town he had never been to before. He tried to start a new life, but nothing felt right. Every day he thought about Ranger and wondered if his partner was alive in the future. He thought about Lyra and hoped she had made it home safely. He had no way of knowing if the beacon had worked or if their sacrifice meant anything. The guilt came back worse than ever. Daniel had survived again when others had died. Kyle had lost 2 members of his team in the assault on the facility. Good men with families who would never see them again. And for what? To send information to a future that might not even exist? Daniel started drinking to numb the pain. He stopped taking care of himself. He was spiraling down into the same dark place he had been in before Ranger and Lyra came into his life. One morning, Daniel woke up and decided he couldn't live like this anymore. He needed answers. He needed to know if what they did mattered. He packed a bag and drove back to the mountains where it all began. He wanted to see the crash site one more time. Maybe there was something there that could tell him what happened. It took him a whole day to hike back to the location. When he arrived, he found the area had been completely cleaned up. There was no sign of Lyra's fighter or any of the technology. The military had removed everything. Daniel sat down on a rock and put his head in his hands. He felt more lost than ever. He had given up everything for a mission he didn't fully understand. He had sent his best friend to an uncertain future, and he had no way of knowing if any of it mattered. Daniel stayed at the crash site until the sun began to set. He was about to leave when something caught his eye. There was a mark on a nearby tree that hadn't been there before. Daniel walked over to the tree and examined the mark. It looked like it had been carved into the bark, but the wood around it was weathered like it had been there for decades. That was impossible because Daniel had been at this exact spot just a few months ago, and the tree had been unmarked. He looked closer and realized the mark was words. They were hard to read, but Daniel could make them out. The message said, "Ranger lived. Humanity endured. Because of you. Mission accomplished." Daniel fell to his knees and read the message again and again. Tears streamed down his face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of relief. Ranger was alive. The mission had worked. Everything they had done mattered. Daniel touched the carved words and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He finally understood that he hadn't survived his unit's death by random chance. He had survived because he had a purpose. He was meant to be here at this exact moment in history to help save the future. Daniel stood up and wiped his eyes. He looked around the forest and noticed other things he hadn't seen before. There were marks on other trees that looked like some kind of pattern. When Daniel stepped back and looked at them from a distance, he realized they formed a perimeter around his old cabin site. Someone from the future was watching over this place. Someone was watching over him. He spent the next few days exploring the area and found more evidence of future intervention. There were small devices hidden in the rocks that looked like sensors. There were places where the plant growth seemed deliberately arranged. Daniel realized that Lyra or someone else from the future had come back to this time and left these signs. They were telling him that he wasn't alone and that what he did would never be forgotten. Daniel decided to rebuild his cabin on the same spot where the old one had burned. As he worked, he felt like he was being watched, but not in a threatening way. It was like having a guardian angel looking over him. He built the new cabin stronger than before with better defenses. He didn't know if the Krell would ever come back, but he wanted to be ready if they did. One morning while working on the cabin, Daniel found something buried near the foundation. It was a small metal case that definitely hadn't been there before. Inside the case was a photograph of Lyra in her uniform, standing next to a fully grown and healthy ranger. The dog looked older but happy. On the back of the photograph was a message in Lyra's handwriting. It said, "Thank you for giving me hope when I had none. Thank you for showing me what it means to be human. Thank you for Ranger. He served with honor for 10 more years and saved countless lives. Because of you, we won." Daniel held the photograph and smiled. He put it in a frame and hung it on the wall of his new cabin. Every day he would look at it and remember that his life had meaning. He had made a difference not just in his own time but in the future of all humanity. The guilt that had haunted him for years finally began to fade. He understood now that survival wasn't something to feel guilty about. It was a gift that gave him the chance to do something important. Daniel stood at the edge of the forest looking at the old military facility through the darkness. Next to him, Lyra was checking her equipment one final time. Ranger sat between them, alert and ready. They had been planning this assault for hours, and now it was time to execute. The facility was crawling with Krell, and every minute they waited, The creatures got closer to opening a full temporal rift. If that happened, the invasion would begin and nothing could stop it. The plan was simple but dangerous. Lyra would make her way to the central chamber where the temporal weak point was located. She needed to set up the quantum beacon and transmit her mission data to the future. While she did that, Daniel would create a distraction to draw the Krell away from her position. It was a suicide mission and they both knew it. The odds of both of them surviving were almost zero, but they had to try because the alternative was the end of humanity. Daniel checked his weapons one last time. He had his rifle with the last of his ammunition, his knife, and 3 homemade explosives. It wasn't much against 6 Krell warriors, but it would have to be enough. He looked at Ranger and the dog looked back with complete trust. Daniel had trained with this dog for years. They could communicate without words and understand each other perfectly. If anyone could pull off this impossible mission, it was them. Lyra placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder and thanked him for everything. She said that humans in her time would remember what he did here. Daniel smiled and told her they hadn't done anything yet. She laughed and said that was exactly the kind of attitude that made humans so dangerous to the Krell. Humans never accepted defeat, even when it was staring them in the face. They always found a way to fight back. The assault began at exactly midnight. Daniel moved toward the eastern side of the facility and started making noise. He fired shots into the air and triggered one of his explosives near the fence. The Krell responded immediately. 4 of them came rushing out of the building toward his position. Daniel ran deeper into the forest, leading them away from Lyra. Ranger stayed close to his side, helping to navigate through the dark terrain. The Krell were fast, but Daniel knew how to use the environment to his advantage. He led them through thick brush that slowed them down. He circled around trees and made it hard for them to get a clear shot with their plasma weapons. Every time they got close, Daniel would drop another explosive or set off a tripwire. The Krell were getting frustrated, and that was exactly what Daniel wanted. Frustrated enemies made mistakes. While Daniel kept the Krell busy, Lyra slipped into the facility through a side entrance. She moved quietly through the corridors, following her scanner toward the central chamber. She encountered one Krell guard along the way and took it down silently with her energy weapon. The facility was dark and filled with the sounds of alien machinery. Lyra had been in countless combat situations before, but this felt different. She was alone in enemy territory, carrying information that could save billions of lives. The pressure was immense. Back in the forest, Daniel was running out of tricks. The Krell were learning his patterns and adapting. They stopped chasing him blindly and started working together to trap him. Daniel realized he needed to change tactics. He stopped running and turned to face them. Ranger stood next to him, ready to fight. Daniel took a deep breath and remembered his training. He had fought in worse situations and survived. He could do this. The first Krell came at him from the left. Daniel fired and hit it in the leg joint. The creature stumbled and Ranger immediately attacked, going for the exposed area. The second Krell fired a plasma bolt that Daniel barely dodged. The heat from the blast was intense and singed his jacket. Daniel returned fire and managed to damage the creature's weapon. It exploded in the Krell's hands and took the creature down. 2 Krell were down, but 2 more were still active. Daniel was almost out of ammunition and his last explosive was still in his pack. He made a split-second decision and threw the explosive directly at the closer Krell. The creature tried to dodge but wasn't fast enough. The explosion knocked both remaining Krell off their feet and bought Daniel a few precious seconds. He grabbed Ranger and ran back toward the facility. He had kept the Krell distracted long enough. Now he needed to make sure Lyra completed her mission. Inside the facility, Lyra had reached the central chamber. The temporal weak point was shimmering in the center of the room like a window into another dimension. The Krell had set up their equipment all around it and the machines were humming with power. Lyra immediately got to work disabling their technology and setting up her beacon. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency even though her heart was pounding. She knew that at any moment more Krell could arrive and her mission would be over. She had just finished calibrating the beacon when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Something big was coming and it was moving fast. Lyra drew her weapon and aimed at the doorway. A massive Krell emerged, and this one was different from the scouts and warriors she had fought before. It was easily 9 feet tall with heavier armor and multiple weapons attached to its body. This was a Krell commander, and it was far more dangerous than anything she had faced. The commander let out a sound that was like a roar mixed with electronic screeching. It raised one of its weapons and fired at Lyra. She dove behind a console as the plasma bolt destroyed the wall where she had been standing. Lyra returned fire, but her shots barely scratched the commander's armor. This creature was built for war, and it would take more than a single soldier to bring it down. Daniel burst into the room with Ranger right behind him. He immediately assessed the situation and saw that Lyra was pinned down by the massive Krell commander. Daniel didn't hesitate. He opened fire on the creature to draw its attention away from Lyra. The commander turned toward this new threat, and Daniel saw intelligence in its multiple eyes. This thing was smart enough to recognize him as the one who had killed its scouts. The commander charged at Daniel with surprising speed. Daniel tried to dodge, but the creature was too fast. It caught him with one of its massive arms and threw him across the room. Daniel hit the wall hard and felt something crack in his ribs. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to stand. Ranger attacked the commander from behind, biting at its legs and trying to slow it down. The commander tried to shake the dog off, but Ranger held on with determination. Lyra used the distraction to finish setting up the beacon. She shouted at Daniel that she needed just one more minute. Daniel nodded and grabbed his knife. If 1 minute was what she needed, then he would give her 1 minute even if it killed him. He charged at the commander and drove his knife into a gap in the armor near its neck. The creature roared in pain and grabbed Daniel with both arms. It lifted him off the ground and started to squeeze. Daniel felt his ribs breaking and couldn't breathe. His vision started to go dark. Then Ranger did something unexpected. The dog let go of the commander's leg and jumped up onto its back. Ranger climbed up the creature's armor and bit down on its neck right where Daniel's knife had created an opening. The commander thrashed wildly, trying to dislodge the dog. It dropped Daniel and focused all its attention on removing Ranger. Daniel fell to the ground, gasping for air. Lyra screamed that the beacon was ready. Daniel looked up and saw the quantum beacon glowing with intense light. The temporal weak point was expanding and beginning to pull everything toward it. Daniel knew what he had to do. He pulled himself to his feet despite the pain and stumbled toward the commander. The creature was still trying to remove Ranger from its back. Daniel picked up a piece of broken equipment and used it as a weapon. He drove it into the same spot where his knife had penetrated and pushed with all his remaining strength. The commander finally went down with Ranger still on its back. Daniel collapsed next to them, breathing heavily. He reached out and touched Ranger. The dog was badly hurt. There was blood matting his fur, and one of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle. Ranger looked at Daniel with those loyal eyes, and Daniel felt his heart break. His partner had given everything to win this fight, and now he was dying. Lyra appeared next to them and examined Ranger quickly. She told Daniel that the dog wouldn't survive without immediate medical attention, the kind of medical attention that didn't exist in this time period. Daniel understood what she was saying. The only way to save Ranger was to send him forward to the future, where they had the technology to heal him. Daniel looked at the beacon and then at Lyra. He made a decision in that moment that would change everything. Daniel knelt beside Ranger and gently stroked the dog's fur. Blood was spreading across the floor, and Ranger's breathing was becoming shallow. The dog had been his companion for years, his only friend, the one thing that kept him going after the war. Now Ranger was dying because of him, because Daniel had asked him to fight monsters from another time. The guilt threatened to overwhelm him, but Daniel pushed it aside. There was still time to save Ranger if he acted now. He looked up at Lyra and told her to take Ranger with her through the temporal rift. Lyra's eyes went wide and she immediately protested. She said the temporal displacement was dangerous. It could kill them both. The beacon was designed to send data, not living beings. The energy required to transport biological matter through time was unpredictable, and the side effects could be catastrophic. But Daniel didn't care about the risks. He had already made his decision. Lyra tried to argue, but Daniel cut her off. He told her that he had spent 3 years wondering why he survived when his entire unit died. He had carried that guilt every single day, and it had nearly destroyed him. Now he finally understood his purpose. He was meant to be here at this exact moment to save Ranger and to help Lyra complete her mission. He wasn't going to waste this chance by playing it safe. Daniel carefully lifted Ranger and carried him toward the beacon. The dog whined softly but didn't resist. Ranger trusted Daniel completely, and if Daniel said this was what needed to happen, then Ranger would accept it. Daniel looked into his partner's eyes and told him to be brave. He told Ranger that he was the best dog anyone could ever ask for. He promised that they would see each other again someday, somehow. Ranger licked Daniel's hand weakly, and Daniel felt tears running down his face. Lyra picked up the quantum beacon and prepared to activate it. She told Daniel one more time that this was dangerous and might not work. Daniel nodded and said he understood. He placed Ranger in Lyra's arms and stepped back. The dog looked at him with confusion and tried to get back to Daniel, but he was too weak to move. Daniel wanted to hold Ranger one more time, but he knew if he did, he might not be able to let go. Instead, he told Lyra to go now before he changed his mind. Lyra activated the beacon and the room filled with blinding blue light. The temporal weak point expanded rapidly and began pulling everything toward it. Daniel felt the force trying to drag him in, but he grabbed onto a broken console and held on. Through the light, he could see Lyra and Ranger beginning to fade like ghosts. The last thing he saw before they disappeared completely was Ranger's eyes looking at him with love and trust. Then they were gone, and the beacon exploded with a force that knocked Daniel unconscious. When Daniel woke up, he didn't know how much time had passed. His whole body hurt and he could barely move. The central chamber was destroyed and fires were burning throughout the facility. He heard voices shouting and realized that Kyle's team had arrived. They must have heard the explosion and come to investigate. Daniel tried to stand, but his broken ribs made it too painful. He lay back down and waited for help to arrive. Kyle found him a few minutes later and immediately called for a medic. Kyle asked what happened and where the woman was. Daniel told him that she was gone and the threat was eliminated. Kyle looked around at the destruction and the remains of the Krell commander. He asked what these creatures were, but Daniel just shook his head. Some questions were better left unanswered. Kyle seemed to understand and helped Daniel to his feet. The military evacuated Daniel to a hospital where he spent 2 weeks recovering from his injuries. During that time, he was questioned repeatedly by officers who wanted to know everything that happened. Daniel stuck to his cover story about terrorists with advanced weapons. He never mentioned time travel or aliens or anything that would make them think he was crazy. Eventually, the military gave up trying to get more information and classified the entire incident as top secret. After Daniel was released from the hospital, he had nowhere to go. His cabin was gone and he had no family. The military gave him some money and a medal for his service, but it all felt hollow. He had saved the future but lost the only thing that mattered to him in the present. For months, Daniel drifted from place to place trying to figure out what to do with his life. The depression came back worse than ever, and he seriously considered giving up. Then one morning, Daniel woke up with a strange feeling that he needed to go back to the mountains. He couldn't explain it, but something was pulling him back to where it all started. He packed his few belongings and drove back to Colorado. The drive took 2 days, and the whole time Daniel wondered if he was making a mistake. What was he hoping to find? Closure? Peace? Some sign that what he did mattered? He hiked to the crash site where he had first found Lyra. The area had been cleaned up by the military, and there was no sign that anything unusual had happened there. Daniel sat on a rock and looked at the sky. He thought about Ranger and hoped his friend was alive somewhere in the future. He thought about Lyra and wondered if she had made it home safely. He had no way of knowing if the mission succeeded or if their sacrifice meant anything at all. As the sun began to set, Daniel stood up to leave. That's when he noticed something on a nearby tree. There were marks carved into the bark that definitely hadn't been there before. Daniel walked over and examined them closely. The carvings were words and they looked weathered as if they had been there for decades. But Daniel had been to this exact spot just a few months ago and the tree had been unmarked. He read the message slowly and his heart began to race. The message said, "Ranger lived. Humanity endured because of you. Mission accomplished, Marine." It was signed by Lyra with her rank in the year 2247. Below the words was a paw print preserved in some kind of metallic substance that didn't exist in Daniel's time. He touched the paw print and felt something break inside him. All the pain and guilt and sadness that he had been carrying for years suddenly lifted. Ranger was alive. The mission worked. Everything he did mattered. Daniel fell to his knees and cried for the first time since Ranger disappeared. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief and joy and gratitude. He had saved his best friend and saved the future. He had finally found his purpose and fulfilled it. The guilt about surviving when his unit died didn't seem as heavy anymore. He understood now that he survived for a reason. He was meant to be here to do something important. Over the next few days, Daniel explored the area around the crash site and found more evidence of intervention from the future. There were small devices hidden in the rocks that monitored the area. There were patterns in the tree growth that formed protective barriers. There were subtle changes in the landscape that only someone who knew what to look for would notice. Someone from the future was watching over this place and watching over him. Daniel decided to rebuild his cabin on the same spot where the old one had burned down. As he worked, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. He was building a new life with a new purpose. He knew now that he wasn't alone. Somewhere in the future, Ranger was alive and Lyra had completed her mission. The Krell invasion had been stopped and humanity had survived. And it was all because one veteran and his dog had made the unthinkable choice. One morning, while digging the foundation for his new cabin, Daniel found a small metal container buried in the ground. It definitely hadn't been there before. Inside was a photograph of Lyra standing next to a fully grown ranger. The dog looked older but healthy and happy. On the back of the photo was a message in Lyra's handwriting. It said, "Ranger served with honor for 10 more years and saved hundreds of lives. He died peacefully surrounded by people who loved him. Thank you for giving him that chance. Thank you for everything." Daniel held the photograph and smiled through his tears. He had made the right choice. Ranger had lived a full life and done what he was born to do. Serve and protect. Save lives, be a hero. Daniel built a frame for the photograph and hung it on the wall of his new cabin. Every day he would look at it and remember that his sacrifice had meaning. He had given up the one thing he loved most so that it could live and thrive. The new cabin was finished after several months of work. It was stronger and better than the old one. Daniel made it a home, and for the first time in years he felt like he belonged somewhere. He started helping other veterans who were struggling with the same issues he had faced. He told them that everyone has a purpose even if they haven't found it yet. He told them that survival isn't something to feel guilty about. It's a gift that gives you the chance to do something meaningful. Years passed and Daniel grew older. He never forgot about Ranger or Lyra or the mission that changed his life. Sometimes at night, he would look at the stars and wonder what was happening up there in the future. He wondered if humans were still fighting the Krell or if they had finally won the war. He wondered if anyone besides Lyra knew what he had done and if his name would be remembered. Then one night, Daniel had a dream. In the dream, he was walking through a forest and Ranger was by his side. The dog looked young and healthy, just like when they first started serving together. They walked together in comfortable silence until they reached a clearing. In the clearing stood